Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by music journalist and critic and tour guide, which we'll talk about later I'm sure, Fiona Shepherd. Hello Fiona.
Hello.
And we're going here to talk about the book Glasgow's Greatest Hits, Tales from the City of Music, which you are involved in, one of three authors. And before we get stuck into the book, can Glasgow claim to be the City of Music? What's its credentials, do you think?
Well, the subtitle was a spin on the fact that Glasgow is a UNESCO City of Music, and we were actually one of the first three cities in the world to be given that title. So, I mean, if you're thinking globally, and allegedly in the top three, certainly one of the first three. So for us, it's always been something to shout about. We formed our tour company to amplify the fact that we had that title. And we've had the title since 2008. So I feel that's where the subtitle of the book came from. But I can't remember a time in my life of gig going that there's not been a vibrant grassroots scene in Glasgow, despite all the challenges that different things have thrown at the city over the years. And I think that we've got a very... I think it's easy to use maybe quite a non-rock and roll word, facilitate music in Glasgow. We have a fertile scene. I think people have a can-do attitude, and if you are not sure what you're doing, you can plug into a lot of, there's a great community essentially, a great grassroots community in Glasgow. I'm not saying that other cities don't have that, of course they do, but when you're really immersed in a place like Glasgow, you can't help but appreciate just how much it's got going for it. And I think it's got now has a global reputation as a music city as well. So I don't think we're just patting ourselves on the back there. I think it is recognised as being a great music city.
Yeah, by other people as well. And you'll go into the kind of break down the reasons that back all of that up, definitely. But before that, how was it written? Because it's yourself, Alison, Stroak and Jonathan Trew, who are the three authors. How did it work between the three of you?
Well, so they're my two colleagues in Glasgow Music City Tours. They're the two people I set the company up with. So I think we always knew it was going to be a joint effort. We'd done a book in Edinburgh before, Edinburgh's Greatest Hits, but that was collaborating with Jim Byers, and it was his idea. So it was kind of his baby, and he asked us to get involved. We just divvied stuff up. I wrote about half the book. I guess that's my background is writing. But Jonathan comes from a writing background too. He's very busy being a blue badge tour guide, so he didn't... I think there was time constraints for him. And then Alison's background is in publishing, and I think she just felt she was up for writing stuff too. And she's an ace researcher. So the material that she came up with was fantastic. Some really great kind of like looking through old primary sources and things like that to come up with stories that are maybe lesser told. So I think between the three of us, we managed to complement each other's skills. And
I guess some of the stories you will know wrote, especially if you're doing the tour, there'll be stories that are linked into that as well. But so how much research did you have to undertake? Was there quite a lot?
Well, I think once we decided what we were going to write about and worked out who was writing what, for any individual entry, I didn't really go straight into it cold. I did research, unless I felt I had a surplus of material. But even then, when you're writing through something, you're doing additional fact checking as you're going as well. And there would always be, because a book is not the same as a tour. So just because we tell a story in the tour, it's not, there's many of the tour stories are in the book, but they're not replicated as they're delivered in the tour. There has to be, it's a different medium, so you have to approach it in a slightly different way, and that will involve extra material, or as I say, just double checking things. So yes, there was. I wouldn't have been comfortable just writing stuff straight off. There had to be a bit of extra research going into it as well.
Because I think music, perhaps more than any other area of the arts, has got apocryphal stories. You know, things which have grown legs, which aren't. If you look into them, they're probably not that true. And I guess on a tour, you might be able to say, well, this person says that, but in a book, you've got to kind of fact check a bit.
Yeah, we love the apocryphal stories though, so we have included apocryphal stories in the book as well. And an example would be, one of my favourite stories is about the legendary time where New York band Suicide had an axe thrown at them at the Apollo. Now, if you go onto the amazing Apollo website and look at the comments, you can go straight to that gig and see, and there's comments from people that were there, and there'll be comments from people saying that never happened.
Yeah.
But Alan Vega, the singer of Suicide, his autobiography alleges that it happened. So that's good enough for us.
Yes,
as far as I'm concerned, that's his version of events. So we are going to, so I think there was, I think we had to be careful over certain things, but we are talking about rock and roll stories.
Yeah.
So we love that aspect of it. I mean, I don't think an entry in the Apollo would be anywhere near as long as it is if it wasn't for apocryphal stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the stories that make the book, the whole thing. It's a wonderful read. Whether you know Glasgow as a music city or not, the structure of the book I'm interested in. It's set into various chapters. Were they easy to come up with?
I think what we did was we looked at what we wanted to include.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew that it would be, unlike the tours where we're really using the venues to tell the stories, we knew we would have a bit more space to write about the artists.
Yeah.
So we knew there was going to be a lot on artists who've come from Glasgow or were born in Glasgow. They maybe moved away, but they were born in the city, so there was some kind of connection to the city. We also knew that we would be, as amateurs, we'd be celebrating venues past and present. So that was easy to come up with. And we knew we would talk about notable gigs. And then there's lots of just ephemera, random stuff. So once we had all the entries, we then just started to divide up into more manageable categories, as it were. But it's essentially people, places and events with a bit on what we call the ecosystem in the city, because we needed to bring things up to date and celebrate the city as it is now, and celebrate that base layer of the pyramid that is the Glasgow music scene, the most important level, the level that supports everything else. And we knew we wanted to celebrate that as well. We're looking back a lot in the book, but we needed to talk about the city as it is now. So it wasn't difficult to come up with what we had to write. Paring back the space to write about was the challenge.
I was going to say, I bet there's a few kind of hit the cutting room floor.
Yeah, there was.
So let's go. The first chapter is the Founding Fathers. A couple of things that strike me there is there's a strong folk influence in this section, which shows you at that point the folk clubs, the stuff that was going on in pubs was really, really important. But the first character is Alex Harvey.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, well, we felt that we wanted to get stuck in with possibly the best loved rock star ever to come out of the city. Now, depending on how old you are, you might be aware of Alex or not aware of Alex, but he's a key figure. And the sensational Alex Harvey Band are one of the pillars. So this Founding Fathers chapter is the people we feel are the pillars of the music scene in Glasgow. And Alex's his life story is fascinating. And it wasn't even that long a life, but he packed a lot into it. And a bit like, I'm not saying that he was Glasgow's David Bowie, but there's a long career before he really hits the mother lode with the sensational Alex Harvey Band. And so in the 60s, he's got an interesting career as a kind of blues shouter, as a rock and roll singer. And of course, famously, he was known for covering the Isley Brothers' Shout. Yeah. And Lulu heard his version of Shout, not the Isley Brothers version, and that's where she got the idea to cover Shout. So Lulu and Alex are contemporaries, so they're right in there at the start of rock and roll. So the very early rock and roll history of Glasgow includes Alex Harvey, but of course he comes into his own in the 1970s with these incredible theatrical performances. And we've already mentioned the Apollo, but the best loved gigs, I would argue, ever to take place at the Apollo, the sensational Alex Harvey Band Christmas shows of 1975, which are so renowned that they get a separate entry in the book.
And the Bowie comparison's a really interesting one, because he then did go on to create the characters Vambo, this kind of pirate look that was so famous and looked so amazing. But he started out, am I right saying he was considered Scotland's Tommy Steele at one point? Was that a comparison?
Yeah, so it was a competition. They were looking to find Scotland's Tommy Steele. So again, you're talking very, very, very early days of rock and roll, when rock and roll wasn't, in some respects, that rock and roll. And Tommy Steele would have been the big star, the big upcoming star at the time. So this was more, well, who's our Tommy Steele? So he entered that competition. So it's a bit of in a way, it's a bit of a misnomer, because he's nothing like Tommy Steele. But it was more just, the comparison was, who could be the next big star? and who could be the next big star from this city. So it was, I guess it was like an early kind of Star Search or an early Pop Idol or something, competition like that.
And including Lulu's interesting as well, because I think some people maybe have some people may think she was a one-hit wonder, but she obviously definitely wasn't, massive. But also that she, and there's a few people at this, left Scotland behind, but again, I don't think that's true.
No, I mean, I think the thing is, she was so key to the book because her roots are entirely embedded in Glasgow. Yeah. And I don't know that she would have been the singer she was without coming from Glasgow. So, and she was one of the artists where I definitely had a newfound respect for her after writing about her, because there were aspects of her career I knew nothing about, particularly the New Roots album, which was really interesting. So she goes off to America and is very respected in America because she had the biggest selling hit in America in 1967 with To Sir With Love. So that's massive global success. And so she's respected as an artist and she's invited over to the States. So she does her own Dusty in Memphis style odyssey over to America as well. Yeah. I think it's turn of the 70s that happens. And then of course you've got, but I suppose as with a lot of artists, she had the opportunity to go on television. So I think maybe people consider her as a variety artist. Think of there was so many television shows that she fronted through the 70s. And so when you move away from a recording career to do something like that, I think maybe you take a bit of a hit to your credibility. And then, of course, she came back with Take That. But I think her ability to reinvent herself through her career is remarkable. And it's not always musical reinventions. But I just found it so interesting so that was definitely one where I had to do a bit of research, because we talk about Lulu a little bit in our tours, but it's just snippets.
Yes.
And we needed more, so I had to look into her life and even finding where her name came from, which I didn't know where her stage name had come from. So that was interesting too. Do you want me to say?
Yeah, as long as I don't want to give any spoilers through the book. But
her manager heard her sing in the Lindella Club, which was in the city centre of Glasgow, and described her as a Lulu of a kid. Right. And so that's where she gets the name Lulu.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. And the next chapter is Pure Dead Glasgow. And first of all, I thought, does that mean these guys are really Glaswegian, or these acts are really Glaswegian? But it's actually, there's something Glasgow about them. They belong to Glasgow in the kind of stereotypical way. Can you talk a bit about who was entered there and why?
It's a good. They belong to Glasgow would have been a good alternative title, actually. Yeah, the artists we decided to put in this group in this chapter are very diverse, but I think the criteria was we couldn't imagine them coming from anywhere else. Yeah. So that was really what it was about. So we're going from the humble bums. So we talk about Connolly and Jerry Rafferty, honorary Glaswegian. For the purposes of this book, Glasgow's got rather wide boundaries.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later on as well.
And we also talk about the Blue Nile, and we talk about Belle and Sebastian. So for me, probably two of the most quintessentially Glaswegian bands that there are. And we've also got Jerry Cinnamon in there, because I can't imagine Jerry Cinnamon coming from anybody else. But it's not just about artists. We include the Grand Ole Opry there, Glasgow's version of a country club. I don't know if you've not been to the Grand Ole Opry, I would recommend that you do go. Brace yourself. But it's just unique. It's unique. So I suppose it was about people and places that were uniquely Glaswegian to us. So that's why we chose to honour them in their own chapter.
And actually that selection shows you kind of the breadth to go from a band, I'm going to say sophisticated as the Blue Nile, musically, and then you've got the grassroots of the Grand Ole Opry, it's quite a distance you would imagine between the two. And also you mention Radio Clyde, which is of course what I listened to growing up, and with the influence of Radio Clyde, I think, and for the music scene in Glasgow, they really did play a lot of the bands that were making music in the city.
Yeah, I think, obviously Radio Clyde's quite a commercial radio station, but I think you've got to think about just what a local radio station means to a city, and there were just great stories around it as well. We wanted to talk about Tiger Tim. Yeah. So we definitely, we're not about celebrating the trendy artists. We're celebrating the who we feel is important, are people who are important culturally in all sorts of different ways. And so it just felt like Radio Clyde had to be in there. Yeah. We could have we could have put it in the ecosystem for talking about what's around now, but I think we felt we wanted to celebrate its heritage. And in fact, the epigraph of our book refers to Radio Clyde. So it kind of, it sort of sums up, for us, it sums up what Glasgow's about. So basically, a broadcaster called Tony Curry recalls what Radio Clyde's mission statement was. And he said, and his take on it was, for Glaswegians, Glasgow is the centre of the universe, and we intend to reflect that. And I just thought, that's amazing. That's what we want to do with our book. So, yeah, very important. I'm just delighted to include something like Radio Clyde in our book.
Yeah, absolutely. It was everywhere growing up. And it's interesting now that you see a lot of people wearing Radio Clyde 261 t-shirts, absolutely nostalgia for who might not listen to it today, but it was so important for certain people growing up.
Well, those t-shirts are iconic, and so much so that when Frank Zappa was interviewed on Radio Clyde, and he loved the t-shirt so much that he was given one and pictured wearing it quite a lot. So actually, it became globally quite trendy at a certain point to have a Radio Clyde 261 t-shirt, and it's still a great logo.
And we're going to move on to venues. And before we talk about them more widely, it's interesting. Now, am I right saying Maestro's became the Cotton Club?
That's right.
And that's where I used to see Tiger Tim regularly on a night out. On a Wednesday night in the Cotton Club, Tiger Tim would be there in all his glory. And these little things, these little stories, and there's lots of them in the book, make you realise it's still quite a small city. There's lots of connections. We've already mentioned some of them, that kind of bring people together. Community, as you said, absolutely vital.
Yeah.
But so the venues are the kind of venues from the past, is that right? You later on you look at the ones that are going today.
Yeah, so we just divided up into past and present, and of course the sad thing was that over the last few years some present venues have now become some past venues. So we had to move some into the past venues category.
All right, okay.
So some recently past venues as well as some long past venues. So places like the 13th Note and the ABC.
Yeah.
In particular, and a huge loss to the city. Yeah. I still feel like the 13th Note might rise again, but the ABC, well, we know that's gone. That's it. It's being pulled down as we speak.
It is indeed, and the 13th Note was a real shock to me because I feel like it wasn't that long ago that it was in there, but there it is, boarded up and closed up for now. Yeah,
I mean we do say temporarily ? In the entry because I'd like to think it will come back. But we don't know. So for the purposes of the book, it's a past venue.
Yeah, and there's a real sadness with these venues that are no longer with us. Because speaking to bands today, one of the challenges they have is finding places to play of certain sizes. You've got big venues, but these smaller venues, it's quite difficult. And nowadays they're often booked up months and months.
I think we're still lucky though in Glasgow. We've got many venues of that size. I think it's more just what the 13th Note represented in terms of it carved a different path for small venues. It wasn't pay to play in the 90s, and for me it built its reputation on that fact alone, because it's essentially a virtuous circle. If you don't have to pay to hire your venue, as a band or a young artist, you don't then need to worry about recouping any money. There's no money to recoup. So you don't have to worry about attracting an audience. Yeah. So you don't have to go in with commercial concerns. Yeah. You can go in with fully creative concerns, and you can play again and again and again and take your time to find your sound. So it's great for creativity. And it doesn't surprise me at all that the 13th Note in the 1990s developed such an amazing scene, an amazing close-knit grassroots scene, and then of course it did spawn huge bands like Mogwai and the Delgados and their 2 record labels, which very much helped to define the city. And then at a later date, Franz Ferdinand, Alex Kapranos very much involved with the 13th Note. So there's many venues like that in Glasgow, and we gather a few of them together in the book talking about them, but we felt that the 13th Note stood out as among the first of those types of venues to have that kind of impact.
And of course a lot of music was getting played in pubs as well. Regular gigs when I lived in the Merchant City, in Blackfriars, going back years, Fix, Rock Garden, places. There was a lot of and you do mention like the Scotia Bar and places like that. Pubs were also a kind of vital part of that ecosystem. Absolutely.
I mean, there's a lot we were not able to mention because a lot of the older venues like the Burns House and the Dial Inn key venues in Glasgow, but they didn't make the cut because we had to make some cruel cuts to get down to the pagination we'd been given and the word count we'd been given. But I hope we can still reflect that scene by mentioning other venues. And the Scotia had to be mentioned because it's key as a folk venue. Yeah. So we had to talk. So we talk about the folk clubs of the 60s and 70s as a one entry where we talk about the different clubs and pubs, and the Scotia is one of them.
Yeah, because going back to the founding fathers, it does include Matt McGinn and Hamish Imlach and these kind of key figures and often larger than life figures.
I mean, these guys are a gift to write about, so we wanted to write about them separately from just the folk scene, because they were, they're long gone and they're very fondly remembered by those that were around at the time and I think by people in the folk scene now, but they're maybe not as widely known outside beyond Scotland perhaps, and we wanted to shout about them a bit because they're really amazing characters, and they wrote a new folk song lexicon for the city, and we talk about in the tours, they wrote local songs, but their local songs had a global impact. Matt McGinn suddenly finds himself over in New York on the bill at Carnegie Hall because Pete Seeger's a big fan, and he's above Robert Zimmerman on the bill, the soon-to-be Bob Dylan, So, and Bob Dylan still talks about Matt McGinn to this day. He's still influenced by Matt McGinn's music. So this man who couldn't believe that he actually was allowed to be a folk singer goes on to influence arguably the greatest folk singer of the last half century.
It's interesting how many, you've mentioned a couple of them already, people go to America to find the acceptance that they may not have had at home for all sorts of reasons, prejudicial, whatever it might be, or don't get above yourself, the classic in a Scottish phrase. And they're in America often just acceptance. Oh, you can sing, you can write songs. Yeah, and there's a few more of those I'm sure we'll talk about on the way. And people will be screaming, you haven't mentioned the Barras, but we'll talk about the Barras later on as well. And for those who don't know, the Apollo, I mean, it's kind of a legend looms large over the city still. What made it such a great venue?
I think it was the Wild West. I think there was something really crazy about it. We've got more stories about the Apollo than every other venue put together on our tours. We don't have the time to spend to tell all the Apollo stories. And the Apollo entry is probably the longest entry in the book. We had to give it like double space to even come close to capturing it. I think it was a large venue, so it was 3,000 capacity. So you're going to attract the bigger touring bands. I don't think, unless you chose to play a stadium, and stadium gigs were not that common back in the 70s, they happened, but unless you were going to play a stadium, it didn't get any bigger than the Apollo. So the superstars of the age are coming to play at the Apollo, and often their support bands are the superstars of the future. So there's lots of great almost like double bills. People talk about Joy Division coming to play in Glasgow, and amazing bills, Ramones and Blondie, things like that. So I think the bands that passed through it were one of the things that make it an amazing space. But I think there was just something in the fabric of that building. I think what's weird about it to me is it's not a custom built venue. It was originally a cinema. So it wasn't built as a venue. So it wasn't custom built to host gigs. So in a way it's amazing. Against the odds, it worked as a venue. I find it hard to capture the magic of the Apollo because I think it did have that classic je ne sais quoi, where it's difficult to say what was it about it, because it certainly wasn't a nice looking place. No. But that was maybe part of it, the sort of scuzziness of the place. There was an excitement the minute you walked through the door in the Apollo. I mean, I'm lucky I got to go once, 6 months before it shut. My first ever gig was at the Apollo, and I went to see Howard Jones, supported by Strawberry Switchblade. Very exciting. But to be honest, once I got there, what I realised was exciting was the Apollo, not what was going on the stage. It was being in the venue, and I thought, this is it. I've arrived. I'm where I'm meant to be. Yeah. And so that was it was a great introduction to the gig going experience. And I think that legacy of the Apollo carries on at Barrowland. Now, Barrowland is a much more, it's more professionally run for a start, but it's got some of that spirit that the Apollo had, where it gets things right on a technical level, but it's more about the atmosphere and the place.
Yeah, there are certain things that come together that you can't quite put your finger on. Some you can put your finger on, but others, it's amazing how many bands recorded their live albums there. The atmosphere was something that we want to get this on record ourselves. And there's a Clash film called Rude Boy, which is stuff at the Apollo. If you ever want to kind of get an idea of what that might be like, that's a good place to kind of go and check it out.
Yeah, and we talk about the Rude Boy film in the Suicide entry, because that is the famous support slot where, so that's, and so again, as part of my research was watching that footage, and checking out how crazy that gig was. That was an utterly notorious gig. Bobby Gillespie talks about it in his memoir too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So absolutely, really kind of. But as much as there was a degree of unpleasantness at that gig, it's also imprinted on people's memories as well, I think. So yeah, you're right. It's a good way to get a sense of like all I can think of is to call it the Wild West. It was the Wild West.
Yeah. And but without the cowboy hearts of the Grand Old Opry.
That's it, yeah. Different kind of Wild West.
Different kind of Wild West. So move on to the next one, which is Top of the Pops. When these are the people that I was going to say they really made it, but actually there's one here that is an interesting character. But let's start with Midge Ure, because I'm a Cambuslang man myself, and you make the idea he's probably the most famous Cambuslang guy, and I think that's probably right. Everyone had a Midge Ure story in Cambuslang, or Ur Jim, as the women down the thing just spoke about him. But it's difficult again to think just how big Midge Ure was. It's not just Live Aid, it's not just Ultravox, it's Thin Lizzy, and it's all sorts of things. Yeah. So he had to be included, I take it.
Absolutely, yeah, because his fingerprints are all over the city. There's so many things he did, and of course it goes right back to him being in the band Salvation in the 70s, and they were regulars playing, they played at Satellite City, they played at the Electric Garden, so they're playing at a lot of the venues we were talking about in our book. And again, he's just a fascinating character, I think, in terms of the different styles of music that he played. I mean, he is really an all-rounder. Mm-hmm. So that there was a good 10-year period where he just went from everything from quite heavy rock to slick synth pop.
Yeah.
Ultravox were my first favourite band.
Right.
So I think he kind of had to be in there. Yeah. But I love this chapter because we are celebrating the people who made great pop music. Yeah. That's really what it's about. Yes. So the music is there's a variety of music, but it's all pop music. Yeah. And again, we are very much there's nothing snobby about our book. No, we love our pop music, and there might be bigger, more acclaimed bands, but we wanted to get in some of the maybe people who maybe only made a brief impression in the charts, but their legacy either lives on, or if it doesn't live on, it deserves to live on. Yeah,
absolutely. And the pops is the key thing there, isn't it? It's not that they became huge stars necessarily, because some people may not know B.A. Robertson, but what a songwriter, and what a legacy he left as well.
Well, we want people reading the book, even the ones that know a lot about music, we want them to find out things they didn't already know.
Absolutely.
And B.A. Robertson is an interesting character because he did a bit of everything. So he wrote songs, he had a couple of hits himself, so he was on Top of the Pops on a few occasions. I absolutely love his story about, we were just talking about the Apollo, he said the Apollo was the only venue in the world where he was booed onto the stage. So there's lots of great stuff, and he was in a film with a young Peter Capaldi, so there's lots of little interesting snippets about this guy, and obviously possibly his greatest work, writing We Have a Dream, the Scotland World Cup song of 1982. So yeah, he packed a lot into his career, and I just think he's an interesting guy. So he was an easy choice to put in the book.
Yeah.
As I say, we weren't making decisions based on commercial profile. We were making decisions based on how interesting is this artist. Mm-hmm. What is there to say about them?
Yeah.
And he's the essence of the book in many respects.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I mean, I loved a lot of his solo singles. That was kind of 70s, 80s when I was starting to get into music. And he could write a pop hook. He was brilliant at that. And you talk about legacy. I'm going to talk to you about Jimmy Somerville, particularly Small Town Boy, which I think is one of the greatest singles ever written, and one of the most important singles ever written. What a legacy to leave there.
Yeah.
And, Jimmy from the kind of Maryhill area, Glasgow, what a star he is.
Absolutely. One of our most amazing. I think it'd be fair to call him a cult artist. Yeah. One of our most amazing cult artists, and of course, Jimmy's an example of somebody that left Glasgow pretty quickly, because Glasgow in the 1980s, as he says it, was not particularly friendly to a young gay man. No. And of course, so Small Town Boy is essentially his story.
The video is him, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, it's his story of having to leave a hard working class town to go to a slightly more, quite to the scuzzier end of London, but to maybe a slightly more accepting environment at that time. So, but of course, we wouldn't be writing about him at all if you hadn't written an amazing song about it. And it is just, I think that song is, for me, that song is eternal. Yeah. That's going to be there, for many, many, many decades to come. And in a way, he is in the book because of that song. Yeah. He's done other great things. Communards were great. Yes. But in a way, it's a decision to write about him because he was involved in one truly classic song. Like one of the, if you're doing a Glasgow playlist, there's something wrong if that song's not on that playlist.
Absolutely. I've got a copy of Carrie Marshall's book, which is called Small Town Joy, looking at Scottish queer music, and it runs through the whole of that book as well. It's just such a brilliant record. But you've got to think about the time it was written and released and go, wow, this is incredible that this is getting such success. I didn't know until recently that one of the other guys in Bronski was from Castlemilk, though.
Oh, I don't think I knew that.
Oh, yeah, I think that's right. We'll have to check. That's what research we'll go into. So now, this is really my area because we're coming up into the 80s. Clyde built megastars. So can you explain a bit about that chapter?
Well, this was, so I think possibly, commercially speaking anyway, the purple period for Glasgow music was the 1980s, where we are delighted that Justin Curry wrote our foreword. He wrote an absolutely amazing foreword for us. But Justin has talked in the past about how there was a period in the 80s where you could just walk down the street carrying a guitar, or even not carrying a guitar, just looking cool, and a London record company man would just pounce on you there and then. Glasgow was so fertile. There was there was rich pickings in the city, and so we wanted to reflect that by talking about a lot of the bands that came out of Glasgow in that period of time. I mean, also we do move into the 90s and the noughties as well. Yeah. But we're really talking about the artists who have made a huge commercial splash. And so I think we put them together in that chapter because we wanted to honour just the artists who've made a huge name for themselves and continue to be big names. And they're maybe, in some respects, they reflect the city they're from, but they're definitely international artists, I would say. Internationally successful artists.
But the music, it seemed to me, and there's lots of music getting made today, and we'll talk a little bit about today near at the end of our chat, but at that point, so I was about 15, 16 in 85, 86, and bands like Hipsway, Hue and Cry, even not ones that didn't get huge, Friends Again, there was just new records getting released every single week that you just kind of had to have. And when you're that age, you think that's normal. Oh, that's just lots of music coming out of this city or near this city. But it did seem to be a really fertile time. And is that because some bands had really broken through, and as often happens, A&R people come up and say, well, let's get the rest of them?
I think that is essentially what it is, because basically you've got there was a great grassroots scene anyway. So we talk in the book about Glasgow banning punk. So there was a kind of doldrums period. Then when the ban is lifted or disappears or is ignored, then we move into post-punk, and everything it's like making up for lost time. And so the roots of all these big commercial bands are actually in the post-punk scene and in something quite DIY and lo-fi. And then it becomes more... It's the punk attitude of rejecting what's gone before. So Postcard Records is actually, in some respects, it's got a punk aesthetic, but it's rejecting the music of punk for something a bit more increasingly sophisticated. And so by the time you get to the early 80s in Glasgow, it's just full of people that are acting like they're living in the south of Italy or they're living in the deep south of America.
Yeah.
They're being escapist, and there's a sophistication, like that idea of that working class sophistication. The idea of I'm working class, I don't have much money, but it doesn't mean I can't dream and I can't present in a more classical way. So there was a lot of that going on, and then so you had that great grassroots scene anyway, which I think would have happened regardless. But the reason why a lot of these artists get signed is because that period of time in the music industry was a golden era financially.
Yeah.
There was a lot of money swirling around the industry at that point, and so people want to spend that money, and they're going to spend that money by signing lots of new artists and giving them huge advances to record albums, and possibly waste a lot of money. But of course, as with anything, only a few of them are going to break through in the long term. So some of them will have a short-term success, a few hits, and then some breakthrough in the long term. What we're discovering in recent years, though, is that so many of the bands of that era captured the imagination of their peers, and many of those bands have now reformed and are playing to more people than they ever did back in the 80s, because even though they only maybe had a few hits, those hits have ingrained themselves in the fans' consciousness. And so when they've come back, people have been more than willing to indulge in that nostalgia. Yeah. And actually, you mentioned Hipsway. Seeing a reformed Hipsway for the first time, for me, that sound was like a portal straight back to the mid-80s. I think I was right back there in the mid-80s. The minute I heard their music.
And I think that's part of the attraction of this one. But it's interesting talking to folk from that era who were signed, and as you say, everything was kind of done for them. The differences today making and releasing music, and it's quite stark and quite interesting as well. And it was the case that you would see, pubs that you would go into, you would see folk who you knew, or maybe knew in the future, that was working behind the bar, and then they would say, I remember seeing that person pulling pints in the cul-de-sac, and there they are on top of the pops. So now indie music's a big part of the book. Indie Gods is the next bit. What have you kind of come up with, but why Glasgow is such a hotbed of indie music? Maybe every kind of major city is, but it does seem that Glasgow embraces independent music.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say Glasgow's in love with guitars, but of course that makes it sound like that's all we care about. And in fact, we've got an incredible electronica scene. But there is a love of a jangly guitar in Glasgow, and there is a love of melody, and melody that doesn't just come through vocals, it comes through guitar playing. So I think that and indie music covers a lot of ground. There's a wide, within calling somebody indie can still cover a lot of ground musically. So it's about the spirit as well in which those bands are forged. Humble roots, maybe not even that ambitious commercially, but maybe aspiring to a creative ambition. Yeah. And then of course some of them do break through, because you can't deny the quality of Franz Ferdinand's music. No. It was obvious from the minute they start playing their parties in Glasgow that there was something happening there that was going to take them somewhere else. But so it's about it. It was another prong of Glasgow's music that we absolutely had to celebrate in the book. It would have been remiss of us not to acknowledge the fact that we are a very strong city for indie pop and indie rock.
And this brings me to talk about the definition of Glasgow, because a lot of the indie bands, particularly we're talking Coatbridge, Bells Hill, East Kilbride, elsewhere, when did you decide to stop the boundary lines for inclusion in the book?
I think if there was someone we wanted to write about that we felt represented Glasgow, I
guess all these bands came in and played in Glasgow. And
we wanted them in the book. So I guess any big city is full of people that are not from that city.
Yes.
And music is one of the things that attracts people into Glasgow. So it's not surprising that if a band forms in a suburb or a satellite town, they are, they're maybe forming there because there's nothing else there for them. So it's, they've got nothing to do but form bands. But then if you want to do something with your music, at some point you're going to have to migrate to the metropolis, where there's more opportunity for your band to play, where you can meet other like-minded people and realise, hey, I'm not so isolated after all. Sure. In fact, we can create a scene here. So we've got our Bells Hill bands in the book. We've got the Mary Chain from East Kilbride, and these guys are all forming. They're part of that post-punk flourishing. So the idea that you could do anything, but their music goes in a different direction. So when some of the other bands are looking for maybe encapsulate a bit more what a lot of people think the 80s was about, which was conspicuous consumption, these guys are rebelling against that. So it was quite tribal in Glasgow in the 80s. And you were either, you were, for want of a better word, you might have been in the Blue-Eyed Soul camp.
Yeah.
If you were me, you were in the Indie Kid camp.
Yeah.
The Splash One camp.
Yes.
The famous indie club that Bobby Gillespie set up. So those, so it, like I say, it was quite tribal, and we wanted to celebrate the other tribe, the tribe of kids that, wore anoraks and stripy t-shirts and that are still being honoured now with the Glasgow's Pop Festival.
Yeah, no,
so
absolutely.
Glasgow's Pop Festival happening in July. It happens every July. Quite a new festival, but it's celebrating that, I guess for want of a better word, the more pure end of what indie pop might be. And again, it's a massive subculture, and these bands have huge but yet cult worldwide following.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are going to come into Glasgow for that. There's people who will make pilgrimages to Glasgow for these bands.
I mean, you could say that those bands that you're talking about, their influences felt more greatly than perhaps some of the other bands who were looking to America for their sound, the Blue-Eyed Soul sort of music that was going on.
I mean, I think it depends what you're talking about in terms of influence. I think if you're talking about influencing other musicians,
yes,
you're probably a bit more likely to be influenced by the indie pop side of things, because it is that there's a certain purity about kind of coming through those punk roots, and there's a very strong aesthetic about those bands, and I think that's appealing. But I still think there's always a strong commercial strand. I think it would be, you can't say that an artist like, say, Lewis Capaldi is not influential.
No.
He's already influencing so many young singers.
Yeah.
With an extremely commercial sound and something that I have to say, for me, quite generic sound, but still influential. But I guess these indie artists that we were talking about, there was something a bit more esoteric about what they were doing, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely. And now you've got, there's the Cult Heroes section, which I think is just interesting because it includes Ivor Cutler and Sydney Devine, which kind of would be two of my guests on my ideal dinner party. It would be amazing to have a conversation with those guys. But I want to move on to notable gigs, and particularly for people that don't know the Big Day, because the Big Day was a huge undertaking. Talk a little bit about that.
It's funny, it doesn't seem to be talked about as much as I would expect it to be, because it's still the biggest music event that ever has taken place in Glasgow, ever. 250,000 people in the streets of Glasgow. So summer of 1990, we're right in the middle of our year as European City of Culture, and this is the big music event of that year, and it's free. So I think that's why the audience is so massive, and they're swarming around different stages within the city. So that was an interesting one to research, because I have to my eternal shame, I didn't go. Don't know why I didn't go. I'd just graduated.
Right.
What was stopping me? I think what was stopping me was I wasn't that fussed about any of the bands on the bill.
Yeah.
So I just thought, I don't want to go to Glasgow Green and see Deacon Blue. And I kind of wish I had now, but at the time I didn't want to. So various gigs around the city. The one that what I remember from that day, finding out about afterwards, was when Billy Bragg performed, and he'd invited Natalie Merchant to play with him, and she brought her pal Michael Stipe of R.E.M. So that was the kind of pop-up surprise of the day.
And that was down to the Clydeside, wasn't it?
That was at the Clydeside.
Bandstand.
Yeah, that was on, was it Atlantic Quay it was called? Maybe, I can't remember, the quayside anyway. And then, of course, we have our notorious Sheena Easton story. And I think that's the one that people do maybe remember. They remember Sheena coming back to Glasgow and her accent being somewhat mid-Atlantic, and her seeming to forget her roots. And I do think, I think we can forgive a lot in Glasgow, but I don't think we can forgive people that have lost touch with their roots, I think. And I think, unfortunately, that's what happened with Sheena. I think that's why her performance was maybe a bit notorious. So those are the stories that came out of that day. But actually, if you look at the bill, there was just so many artists, many Glasgow bands, but also bands from elsewhere playing as well.
I think Sheena Easton's a really interesting character as well, because, again, goes to America to kind of find big success and perhaps acceptance. Nobody cares that she came from Coatbridge and was on the telly to become a star and all of those things. And I think, again, that's an interesting aspect of it. But, yeah. Hello, England? Was that there? Something like
It's great to be back in England.
Yeah. That's not going to go down well with the lads.
That I think for most people, that's a betrayal of your roots if you come back to Glasgow and say that.
And you also look at, as well as other venues, clubs, particularly the Sub Club, I think, was perhaps the one that's got the biggest, to this day, kind of influence, would you say?
Yeah, I mean...
And for dance music, I should say.
Absolutely. Well, we wanted to reflect... In some way, we wanted to reflect the electronica scene in Glasgow, and we wanted to talk about slam as well. And they're so associated with the Sub Club. You know, they were there right at the start. They were in with the Bricks when it changed its name from Lucifer's to the Sub Club. I mean, it's got an interesting history before that. It was a jazz venue before that, so that was really interesting to talk about as well. But we had to. We felt like we, you know, like I mean, I'm not saying Daft Punk wouldn't have happened without slam, but Daft Punk, you know, Daft Punk was released on Soma Records, and Daft Punk were hanging out in the Sub Club. It's an internationally famous club. So, and you know, the nightclub scene in Glasgow, a bit like other cultural scenes in Glasgow, has waxed and waned over the years.
Yeah, sure.
And many would say it's not in a great place right now, but the Sub Club prevails.
Yeah.
And that tells you probably all you need to know about what a great club is. And it's tiny.
Yeah.
So it's that thing about, it's that, you know, a lot of the world's legendary clubs are teeny tiny.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, I think about the Blitz Club in London in the early 80s. I mean, that was a tiny group of about a couple of hundred people that then went on to form Culture Club and, you know, Hazy Fantasy, and, you know, so from small clubs and club scenes, great music can spring. And not just Glasgow, the west of Scotland has a real love affair with electronic music of differing varieties, you know, from kind of quite hard, from the more indie end of electro right through to kind of handbag house and kind of, you know, almost like nosebleed paces, BPMs kind
absolutely.
of thing. But we felt that if we were going to try and represent it, the Sub Club had to be the place that we honoured.
Because it was also important in moving house music in this country, like the links with Detroit and a lot of these guys. It was sensational. My little Sub Club story was being there probably on a Wednesday night, and it was dead. But there was the Pet Shop Boys, and Chris was up dancing, and Neil was sitting down in his coat. But yeah, the other venues I think that we think about now are the huge ones, the Hydro, and I mean, I have to admit I have not been to many at the Hydro because it's not my kind of thing. But these have been important in Glasgow's music, kind of what's happening now, I guess.
I felt like we had to put the Hydro in. It's not that new a venue anymore now. It's now more than a decade old. Yeah. But it's not one because gig going is so professionalised now, and health and safety is such a big thing. You're never going to get Apollo League stories coming out the Hydro. It's just not possible anymore. It wouldn't happen. And perhaps our physical selves should be glad of that we're in a safer environment when we go into these venues. But if you think about who's played the Hydro, and without the Hydro in the city, the artists we'd be missing out on. You know, even in the last 2 weeks, where would Billie Eilish have played in the city if the Hydro wasn't there? Where would Diana Ross come and play if the Hydro wasn't there? You know, and a lot of rock bands as well. So I spend, because of my job writing about music, I spend a lot of time at the Hydro. And it's not my favourite venue to be in terms of the experience of getting there. But when the lights go down, and the show starts, it's an incredible space to put in large-scale pieces of pop theatre. That Billie Eilish show was a remarkable piece of stagecraft, and you wouldn't fit her stage into any other venue in the city.
Not SECC or anything, it's just too big. And I guess often these shows may be the ones that inspire next generation to go out and do it for themselves, if you like.
I often think even if I'm watching an artist I'm not that keen on, so I saw Tate McRae there a couple of weeks ago, and I was just looking around at all the teenage girls in the audience and thinking, how many of these is this their first ever gig?
Yeah, sure.
Probably many. And look at how much they are loving this show. What a great introduction to live music, and I hope they carry on with it. My worry, of course, is if you're only seeing stuff at that level, then you can only afford to go to a couple of those shows a year because the price of the tickets is so high, and you could go to many more gigs if you were going to smaller shows. That would be my only concern. But I still think it's a great way to keep music live, to make people appreciate what it is like to be in a room with 13,000 other people, all with a common goal in mind. I know it's a cliche, but music is a great unifier in very, very divisive times. For even if it's just for an hour and a half or 2 hours, you're all together in the one space, looking in the same direction with the one goal in mind to enjoy that concert.
With your pals, all knowing the words. It really is a very powerful thing. I think one of the things the book does so well is to show people, if they don't know, they might like certain music or certain gigs or whatever it might be, there's so much more to get out and explore. I'm interested by the Did You Know section, partly because are there things that, have you got favourite stories that maybe Did You Know stories?
Well, I love the story about Woody Guthrie coming to Glasgow for a couple of days during the Second World War and drinking his way along the Broomielaw, allegedly doing a gig in the Victoria Bar.
Right.
I've been told by one of my tour customers that couldn't possibly have happened, but we do like to print the legend. And writing a song about Glasgow. And of course the lyrics, the song, for those that are unaware of Woody Guthrie, well, if you've seen the Bob Dylan film, you'll see that Woody Guthrie is a key character in that film, so influential, the father of protest music, and somebody who's feels like he's from as far away from Glasgow as he can possibly be. He's from Oklahoma, and but because of the war, because he was a merchant in the merchant navy, he finds himself in this city, and he's he's like a travelling troubadour. So he's just around and about, soaking up the city, likes what he sees, does what any troubadour does, writes some lyrics. He wrote many, many songs, as far as we're aware, but only a handful were recorded in his lifetime. So essentially, thanks to the Woody Guthrie archive curated by his daughter, all his lyrics are still available. And thanks to Billy Bragg, who's been taking a lot of those lyrics over the years and adding his music to it, he found when he basically played a Woody Guthrie centenary gig in Glasgow at the ABC, and wanted to find something about the city, and found these lyrics, Scotch Hills, or Going Up the Clyde as it's also known, and decided that he would write music for it. And I think that's an amazing story, and that wasn't one that I was aware of, I think, until we started doing the tours, but it's been a key story in our tours over the years. There's many. Yeah. It's such an interesting chapter.
Yes, it is.
We talk about the kind of history of political music in Glasgow, and Paul Robeson coming to the city and leading the May Day parade, and the Upper Clyde shipbuilders working, and the album that was recorded of songs to support those workers. We talk about Glasgow banning punk. I've already alluded to that. Yes. That's a story a lot of people know, but it's good to tell that story again, because it's a key to understanding the city's music scene, and that there was a period where everything wasn't that rosy for music in Glasgow. But essentially what happens is, as I said earlier, we make up for lost time when the ban is lifted, and so we get this massive, without the ban in punk, would we have had the massive flourishing of stuff afterwards? Maybe we would have. But it's very, very important part of Glasgow's music story.
Yeah, and as you say, it's a book of highs and lows and ups and downs. I'm thinking also of, there was a period, I'm going to say 80s into 90s, it might even be a bit later, where Glasgow Council was really cutting down on dance music, and so people were getting on buses and going out to Livingston or going out to... So sometimes it's what is not happening, which kind of helps define what is going to happen later on.
Yeah, and the thing is, the people of Glasgow want to dance, they want to play gigs, they want to go to gigs, they want to sing along to gigs. If you tell them they can't do it, they'll find a place where they can do it. So in the case of punk, it was Paisley. Yeah. People went to Paisley to watch punk gigs. And in fact, with the dance music as well, Club 69 in Paisley was a pilgrimage for people from Glasgow to go out to this club where it was a bit more free and easy, and quite dressed down and come as you are. So... we can't talk about Glasgow music without talking about Paisley. We're always going to have, Paisley was always going to be part of our book.
There's so much in the book. We could talk for another couple of hours. We've not really mentioned the Glasgow City Music Tours. I think we should let people know where they can find out about those. Where would be the best place for?
Probably our website. So our website is glasgowmusiccitytours.com. And you can go on there, you find out. We run 2 scheduled tours on Saturdays. The Saturday morning one is the Merchant City and Barrowland area, and the afternoon one we call the Music Mile, and we go from the concert hall right the way along Sucky Hall Street and Renfrew Street and down to King Tut's. So those are our scheduled tours. We also run private tours. We do a Celtic Connections tour in January where we concentrate on the folk music history of the city. We wrote a bespoke tour for Paisley Book Festival, who were kind enough to stock our book just a few months ago. Yeah. So we have a Paisley tour. So we have a variety of things that we do, but you can find out about all of it and book for a tour or buy a gift voucher, a gift of a tour for a loved one, and indeed also buy our book. You can do all of that on our website, glasgowmusiccitytours.com.
And if you've enjoyed our chat, then, get the book and go on the tour and find out so much more. Do you think there'll be a part 2? Because there seems to me there's lots more that could have been in here.
Maybe. I mean, we haven't talked about that yet. We did have to cut quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I think we did a good job of distilling the essence. So I'm happy with what we do have in the book. Well, remains to be seen if we get people telling us you've got to include such and such. And we would probably agree with them. But the brief is it's a pocket book.
Yeah.
So it's not a tome.
Yes.
And that's why we chose to tell the story of the history of Glasgow through bite-sized chunks.
Yeah.
In bite-sized chunks, bite-sized stories. So it's not... I was going to say it's not like it's not an overview, but actually you will get an overview of the city through reading the whole book. But it's written in a manageable way where you can just dip in, read some funny stories, and by the end of the book, you'll have a sense of. We hope we've captured the essence of the Glasgow music scene.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have. You really have. Fiona, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me. There's so much we haven't spoken about. We haven't even touched on what's happening today, and it's not just about the past. There is mentions and sections on what's happening today, but people wanted to go and buy it to find out that for themselves.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Fiona.
Thanks for asking me.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.